Thanks very much, Alex. And hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining today. My name's Ellie Rowe-Wright, and I'm a qualitative specialist here at Jigsaw Research. A few more facts about me that I wanted to share. So I'm also a white British female, born and raised in London. I'm 25, so I'm just on the cusp of being part of Gen Z or Gen Z, depending which side of the Atlantic you're joining us from. And I'm a university graduate from a middle-class background. Taking all of those facts together, I'm someone that most people would consider or even expect to be woke. And to be honest, if you ask me whether I consider myself to be woke today, I would probably say yes. But compared to my answer a year ago, I'd definitely be much less certain and probably much less forthright in sharing my opinions on woke topics. Recently, I found myself getting increasingly irritated when someone calls me woke. I've also found myself skirting around any discussions to do with race, gender, or sexuality when speaking to friends and family in an attempt to keep the peace. By the same token, I started to notice research participants exhibiting similar characteristics to myself, seeming to hold back from speaking up on some of these topics or saying what they think is the right thing to say rather than what they actually believe. All of this made me start to wonder about whether the authenticity of our research is at risk in the current climate. This is what led me to approach my colleagues with this idea for a piece of self-funded research, which we've titled Unveiling Silent Majorities, Woke Culture and Youth Audiences. The research was ultimately looking to answer two key questions. The first, do all young people feel aligned with wokeness, or is there more nuance to their views? And the second, and in my opinion, potentially more importantly, are young people holding back what they really think and feel about these topics of race, gender, and sexuality because they don't want to be seen as too woke or even not woke enough? I'm going to start by explaining a little bit about the background of this research as well as what we did. And I thought it'd be useful to start off with a bit of a history of the word woke to help us understand where this word woke comes from and what it means. Many of you may be surprised to learn that the first recordings of the word came in the first half of the 20th century as the civil rights movement gained momentum. One of its earliest uses was by blues singer Lead Belly, who used it to warn African Americans to stay awake or stay woke to white racial aggression and violence in his song about the mistrial of the Scottsboro Boys. Over time, the word gained traction in African American arts and culture, before more recently becoming closely tied to the Black Lives Matter movement in 2014, following the police shooting of Michael Brown, when activists warned one another to stay woke to racially aggravated police brutality. Since then, the word has shifted in meaning quite significantly in a pretty short space of time. It's entered mainstream narratives in media, politics, and in wider society, and it can mean many different things depending on who you're talking to, what you're talking about, and where you're talking to them. Woke is an incredibly nuanced and knotty term, and to be frank, I'm not here today to share a kind of new definition of the word, nor am I going to provide a solution to kind of bring together all these polarizing views that we're potentially witnessing at the moment. But hopefully what we can do is stir up some fresh thinking about how to engage with this audience from a research perspective to really ensure that we can continue to deliver authenticity and honesty of our insights and hopefully be able to speak to young people as an audience. What did we do? Very briefly, I'll touch on what we did for this research. We adopted a mixed method approach. This was so we could ensure we got both a statistically sound understanding of what this audience were thinking before really digging into the feelings, motivations, assumptions, and behaviours that were driving some of these views. We ran a survey with 1,000 16 to 34-year-olds, half in the UK and half in the US, as well as 12 friendship paired depth interviews conducted online with a really broad range of demographics and a spectrum of political views, half of those with participants in the UK and half in the US. Moving on then to what we actually found, and I'm going to start off by sharing a little bit about that first question. Do all young people feel aligned with wokeness? I guess the crux of it is that lots of young people have heard of the word woke, but a large number are not really sure what it means. 83% of young people say they've heard of the word woke, and Americans are significantly more likely to say they've heard of the word woke, which I think is relatively unsurprising, given how kind of central the word has become in political rhetoric and campaign narratives in the US. But I also want to pause and just call out the fact that 17% of young people said that they had not heard of the word woke, which I think, considering that they're a generation who is kind of categorized as the woke generation, is quite a staggering number of young people who say they haven't even heard of the word. A quarter of young people admit though, that they're not sure what woke actually means. And participants in the qualitative portion of the research defined it in loads of different ways. Some people said it was about someone being overly sensitive or even pretentious, whereas others thought it was someone being compassionate or caring or very well versed on issues of social equality. And we found that many people often second guess themselves after they kind of quite confidently defined it at the start. As they started to engage with the discussion more and think about the word woke more, they became increasingly confused. And there was a real sense that the meaning of what woke is has become very confused in recent times. In fact, 40% of young people say they're not sure whether woke, they say that woke is neither a positive or a negative thing. And I think that really speaks to the confusion around the term. For those in the qualitative research, the media and social media were very much seen as the malevolent catalyst of this confusion. Young people accuse the media and social media of really pushing a kind of intentionally negative narrative around wokeness and young people, which some felt was not only kind of unfair and inaccurate, but it also invalidated their views when they engaged in some of these key societal debates. And that was particularly frustrating for those who don't see themselves as woke and have never really seen themselves as woke. Lots of young people are rejecting wokeness, but I think really importantly, some never actually identified with it in the first place, despite what you might have seen or read or heard elsewhere about young people. A good chunk of young people do consider themselves to be woke. So 40% of young people in the UK and 51% of young people in the US say that they do consider themselves to be woke. But around a third of young people in the UK and the US say that they do not see themselves as woke, and around a quarter in the UK and a fifth in the US say that they don't know. This obviously directly counters the narrative that all young people are woke. And in the Kroll research, we found something similar. There are, of course, young people who never identified with woke in the first place. They say they believe in the equality of race, gender, and sexuality, but they've long rejected perspectives or societal approaches that they think are kind of more extreme or more outlandish. For example, the policy of affirmative action in the US and the idea of cultural appropriation. Other young people we spoke to who previously identified with woke are feeling increasingly disenfranchised with the term. They feel it's been weaponized and it no longer promotes a characteristic that they'd be proud to promote. But across the board, kind of both for the political left and the political right, the word is felt to have become almost a caricature, and many feel it's lost value in conversations. They feel it's become so confused, it's now considered potentially meaningless. I think overlooking this nuance is not something that should be taken lightly. It can actually really damage a brand's reputation with this audience. For participants both on the political left and the political right, there was a sense that brands can take wokeness too far in an attempt to speak to audiences like themselves. Doing so can come at a risk of the brand feeling inauthentic and potentially unrelatable, as many young people don't align with these views. One example, which was mentioned by participants, was the Virgin Atlantic See the World Differently ad, which, whilst people could understand what they were trying to do, it often jarred. So one young male Labour voter said, "It can feel stereotypical, like you're showing gay men as feminine when that is not always the case." The first thing that comes to mind is the Virgin Atlantic advert. They're all on a plane. It's got an Asian man, a white woman, black woman, gay man. It gets to the point where you think that that's not what you would actually see on a plane. The gay man has got dyed hair and sparkly eyeshadow. It's a stereotype. They're taking it too far. They're trying to tick all the boxes. It's not realistic. What does this mean for us delivering authenticity in research? So obviously we now know that not all young people are woke. But I think, to be honest, most of you could have probably guessed or told me that at the very start of this presentation. What I think is particularly interesting and potentially kind of most important is the answer to our second question. Are young people holding back because they don't want to be seen as too woke or not woke enough? And ultimately, our research has shown that a large amount of young people are holding back. Just under half of young people in the UK admit to self-censoring, both due to fears of appearing too woke as well as not woke enough. And in the US, over half of young people admit to the same. This is a trend that is kind of emulated elsewhere in society and across other generations. A recent paper by political scientists James Gibson and Joseph Sutherland exploring self-censorship in the US found that by 2019, 40% of Americans say they do not feel free to speak their minds, compared to 13.4% in the 1940s. And that was felt the same across Republicans and Democrats. Our poll participants said the same thing. whether on the political left or on the political right. Young people are feeling nervous to speak up on woke topics. For example, when they might have a view that is considered more woke than the views of those they're talking to, and so they hold back to avoid criticism or conflict. One example of this came up when we're speaking to young people in the southern US states, where they felt the threat of conflict or criticism was much more real. For example, when they were talking to their neighbours or family members. There was a real sense for these young people that the culture wars was actually playing out in reality. And in some areas, aligning to woke values could have real consequences in terms of violence and aggression from those in your community. Young people might also hold back, though, when they're expressing a view that they think isn't as woke as those they're talking to. Most commonly, this was felt by young people when discussing the topic of gender and sexuality. For example, one female aged 16 to 18 spoke about her concerns of using the they-them pronouns. A friend of hers had recently come out as non-binary, and not long after this, she mispronounced them by accident. The friend was really angry, and the girl faced a lot of backlash from lots of her friends. She now finds it much safer to stay silent about these topics rather than engage in any sort of conversation like this moving forward. She felt a real nervousness about expressing a view that kind of runs counter to what is stereotyped as the most compassionate point of view. In case she was, or they are branded as kind of racist, homophobic, transphobic, or something similar. And there's a belief amongst young people that they're supposed to know the answers without really being allowed to ask the questions. Ultimately, self-censorship is driven by two main factors. The first is the fear of backlash. A young male Conservative voter in the UK said, "My concern is the potential negative feedback you might get, maybe being perceived as a racist, a sexist, or whatever the topic is. People's perceptions of you are important. I think a neutral perception of someone is better than a negative perception of someone." Fear of backlash is a really commonly known reason for why one might self-censor. Obviously, no one wants to be judged or criticised or cast out of their social circle. However, the reality of being ostracised or what might be called cancelled these days has taken a very different shape with the rise of social media. As young people's personal lives and personal information are kind of out there for any and everyone to access online, so too is the increased potential for criticism and heightened reputational risk. The second is something slightly different, though. This is about a concern for others' feelings or a kind of fear of hurting others' feelings. A young female Democrat in the US said, "I might not completely change what I think, but I would probably not say as much out of respect. If someone is really sensitive about a particular social issue, it's usually because they have someone they know or they're in a marginalised group. They have a lot of emotion in it, so I don't want to take away from that." For most, this is about not upsetting or diminishing someone's lived experience. Going back to that example of mispronouncing someone, young people are hyper aware of the potential of kind of disrespecting or diminishing the lived experience of someone by saying the wrong thing. And this could also play out in different ways. For example, when engaging with their grandparents or their family, the people who they kind of respect in their lives, but who may have different views to themselves because they kind of potentially grew up in different times. And don't get me wrong, self-censoring is not always a bad thing. It's not a bad thing that they're trying not to hurt someone's feelings. And in some cases, it is kind of necessary and really important. In qual research, we know this better than most. But I do think we need to consider the longer term impacts of this. As this idea of cancel culture gains more traction, young people are becoming increasingly reticent, holding back what they potentially really think and what they really feel, and not speaking out when they disagree with others. There is a potential for this to lead to stunted education. One participant we spoke to explained how she got in trouble for using a certain word when she asked a question to her lecturer at university. So she now chooses not to ask any questions about anything potentially related to woke culture at university because she would rather not know than say something wrong or offensive by mistake. Again, it comes back to this expectation she felt of kind of being expected to know the answers without being allowed to ask the questions. And this, I think, has the potential to lead to an increased polarization as people are finding safety in those closest to them. For example, their friends or their peers, who often have similar views to themselves, but they're also avoiding those confronting conversations with those who don't, potentially creating an echo chamber both on the political left and the political right and driving each side further apart. So what does this all mean? What kind of next? And of course, you probably expect me to say this as it is my job and I do it every day, but I do genuinely believe that qual research has a really important role kind of now more than ever. We can't know what's going on with these young people through kind of just simply scanning social media or putting out a simple poll. I think we need to really get in front of these young people and have really authentic conversations. These aren't conversations that they're having organically, and I think we're in a good position to try and facilitate these and to help us understand what they're really thinking and feeling. And obviously it might sound really simple, but I think it's important to kind of start at the basic level and recognize that researchers and brands need to ask themselves some really important questions when looking at topics that might be considered woke. For core researchers, we need to consider what questions we're really trying to answer and therefore what approach we might need to take in order to get to that answer. For example, are you answering the question, what do young people think and feel about trans women competing in women's sports? In which case you might want to adopt a methodology that really enables young people to open up and share their views as an individual from their kind of individual perspective. Or are you answering the question, what policy should the World Athletics Organization implement around trans women competing in women's sports? Of course, you still want to hear their open and honest views, but perhaps from a different perspective. It's more about their social view, a kind of methodology that will enable participants to bring their views together. Likewise, brands need to think through what they want to achieve out of their kind of ambitions with this particular audience, but out of their next ad campaign or piece of communication or kind of strategic move. What audience do brands want to try and capture? There is a risk when you're kind of saying anything potentially political or woke in a way that you could risk losing some audience. So it's about kind of asking yourself, which risk are you willing to take? We wanted to share a few learnings that we've taken from conducting this research, but also from other pieces of research that we've done over the past year or so. The first is thinking closely about the role of the moderator, which I know is something we should always consider when we do core research, but I think it's increasingly important when discussing topics like this. Really thinking through how can the moderator put the participant at ease and become a voice that's kind of trusted, where the participant feels they're able to open up without being judged or kind of potentially facing any consequences. How can they kind of create this sense of Chatham House rules within these participants? And I think demographics play a really important part in this. Thinking about the demographics between the moderator and the participant in terms of their ages, their race, their genders, can have a really big impact. And we decided in this research to gender map moderators. So we weren't ultimately convinced that a 25-year-old boy was going to tell me everything they thought about the patriarchy. So a couple of my male colleagues kindly stepped in and took on moderation of the male friendship pairs, which I think actually worked really nicely. And the use of individual tasks. So obviously, if you're conducting a focus group, for example, it can be really useful to make use of tasks completed individually. This can give you a sense of whether there are any disparities between what people kind of say from an individual perspective and in that kind of one-on-one setting versus in a group setting and their kind of social view. And you can use this to not only kind of tease out nuance of opinion, but it also can be used by moderators as a tool during the sessions to get people to kind of consider different perspectives and maybe kind of entice debate and discussion about the topic. We also use friendship decks in the research, as I said at the very start. And to be honest, sometimes it worked really well and kind of, really helped us get to the heart of what we wanted, and sometimes it didn't. We often found that with the young female friendship pairs, it was a really effective tool for getting them to relax and open up about their views and opinions. However, with the young males, we had the feeling that there was a bit of reputation management going on. If you had two male pairs who were kind of both right-wing, if one of them was potentially a bit more right-leaning than the other, they both tended to go to that more kind of right-leaning position. And likewise on the left, if you had one male pair who is more left-leaning than the other, they both went that way. And we also had a few friendship pairs or even couples where it was a kind of male-female combination, of which I moderated quite a few of those. And the male, to be honest, often just nodded along with whatever the female said. I even actually had one case where the male literally turned to his partner after I asked a question and said, "What do I think?" So yeah, we weren't necessarily getting to the kind of crux of what they necessarily were thinking and feeling in this method. I think the use of stimulus with topics like these is also really important. It can be quite difficult for people in general to speak off the cuff about these kind of big social issues, particularly where some of them feel quite abstract, for example, the patriarchy. So we used a lot of stimulus to really generate discussion and tease out opinion, including news articles, clips of programs, YouTube videos, and images to show a really broad range of opinions and perspectives. This formed the basis of the discussion and worked really well to help us and the participants start to see where they drew their own line of acceptability. What things did they see as woke and what things did they see as morally right? What things did they see as kind of going a bit far? And finally, follow-up depth. So we didn't use follow-up depths for this project, but I think they could potentially have been a really useful tool for us to use, for those kind of male-only pairs or the mixed gender pairs. It could have been a really nice way for us to get to what some of those people were thinking and what we didn't hear in the actual friendship pair sessions. But we did actually use follow-up depths in a recent project exploring the role of sex and violence on TV. We ran a series of focus groups and conducted some follow-up depth interviews with a selection of participants. And it was really revealing as participants in those follow-up depths sometimes admitted to kind of not feeling able necessarily to share some of their views on these topics in the group setting. For example, one gentleman explained that he was concerned about saying something in the group that might have been seen as kind of anti-woke because there were two policemen in the group. And he felt that the two policemen were saying what they think they should say, given their kind of role in society, rather than what they actually thought as individuals. And this made him more kind of inclined to agree with them because he didn't want to kind of say anything too controversial or potentially disagree with the two policemen who were kind of seen as the moral compass in the group. To wrap up, I do think there is kind of a potential risk to authenticity of research tied up in the current climate of cancelling alternate views and self-censorship and the kind of negative connotations that are surrounding the word woke. But I also think research and qual research offers a really unique position to enable young people to have these potentially difficult conversations in neutral and hopefully safer spaces if we're able to do them right. Finally, I want to leave you with some of the words from participants themselves, talking about their experiences of self-censorship.
I don't want to mispronoun you, and I don't want to hurt your feelings because you're also a human being and you deserve that right of respect.
Potentially, if I didn't know like sexuality, I wouldn't want to say something that would cause offence.
I feel a bit withdrawn and held back purely because I just don't want to offend anyone.
I moved from like a smaller rural area, so like it was kind of split between like very conservative and then very liberal. So I mean, you kind of had to not watch what you said, but be a little bit more mindful and a little bit more like neutral when talking to people.
People tend to hate you, and so it becomes a lot harder to at least just make a simple friend. And some people post about it in their social media, which tends to get publicity that nobody wants.
As well, I was going to say like the pronouns, because some people are very like specific with their pronouns, and if you accidentally say the wrong thing, that can create a massive problem with it, and then you can be like posted online. Like I saw a video where someone in Starbucks used the wrong pronouns and the person got cancelled online, got loads of abuse. So you want to be a bit careful with like the things you say.
Again, it's that fear of like being canceled or like being pointed as like someone who's so bad and so negative, and now I hate trans people and now I hate different things like that, and that's not the case at all.
Like if it's just someone like your friends, then it might be a bit different, but with like family, I think it's like you don't really want that conflict.
Or upsetting people.
To me, I'm not trying to say ruin a good conversation or ruin a specific friendship just over a simple belief I had.
I'm also tired. I'm tired of having to censor myself all the time.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Ellie, for that. That was fantastic. So thank you for taking us through that. So what we'll do now is we'll stop sharing that, and we'll have a quick look at the chat to see if any questions have been posted up there. Yeah, we have a few questions actually. That's fantastic. So again, as I mentioned earlier, if you have any questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat. I also noticed a couple of people have joined probably quite close to the end of the session. So just so you know, we will be sending out copies of the charts to everybody who's attended. So if you have a look at the charts and you'd like to have another session, you know, we can always set up another chat about it. So we're quite happy to do that. So let's have a look at if there's any questions. Yes, so here's a question I can see. How do you manage your own biases when conducting this kind of research, Ellie?
Yeah, I think it's a kind of something that as researchers, qual researchers, we have to be quite attuned to in any sort of project that we do. But I think it's about being kind of hyper aware of it when you're addressing topics like these, keeping the conversation very open and allowing the participant to kind of lead the direction of travel in a way, rather than kind of leading them down any sort of route or probing them too much. I also think the use of stimulus was really important here, because we used stimulus that showed loads of different perspectives and opinions. So they very much were responding to kind of a very broad spectrum, which definitely didn't always chime with what the moderator thought or felt about the specific topic. So yeah, hopefully that answers that.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And here's another one I've just seen come in. What was the most surprising thing that you learned running the project?
I think one of them was that I was quite surprised at the number of young people who said they didn't consider themselves to be woke. So I don't think we had one qual participant that said they would consider themselves to be woke, which I think shocked me quite a bit. I was kind of expecting a few people to come to the interviews being quite, vocal about their opinions on woke topics, if that makes sense. But even on the left-leaning participants, they didn't see themselves as woke, which kind of surprised me quite a lot going into the research. I had different expectations. I think another thing also that I was more shocked by than surprised was when speaking to participants in the southern US and their kind of experiences of cancel culture, the culture wars playing out in the southern US states. It was quite kind of scary, I think, some of the kind of repercussions that they could face if they did voice a view that was kind of seen as too woke or something. There was a real potential threat of violence or aggression from people in the community, which kind of, I don't know, it was quite shocking to hear.
Yeah, almost like terminal cancelling, I guess, in some sense. People sort of raising their fears about, which again we don't really seem to have in the UK so much. Here's an interesting one actually I've just seen come in. Have you thought about using AI to analyse social media conversations, etc., to see if that gets more authentic responses or findings?
Yes, we have thought about using AI. I mean, yeah, social media is an interesting one because, as I was saying through the research, just looking at social media at kind of face value, I don't necessarily think kind of really depicts the real views of young people based on what we heard in the research. And this idea of using AI to try and dig deeper is a really interesting one, and one that we're actually going to be exploring in the new year with a piece of research we'll be doing, where we'll be comparing what we found in this research with what AI finds about these young people. So yeah, stay tuned because we'll be presenting that research at an MRS conference in March, I believe. So yeah, I won't share any of the findings now, but do stay tuned to hear more.
Yeah, fantastic. And that is actually the MRS conference. I think it's called Impact nowadays. And I think if anyone's got any final questions, please type them in. There's one last one that's already on there, and we'll answer this one and then wrap up unless there's other questions that come in. So this last question is, what does all this mean for brands? Does it mean don't take a political or social good point of view at all?
I don't think it means don't take a social stance or view. I think it's about taking a view that's actually kind of relevant and authentic to you as a brand, but also recognizing that there is a risk that you take when you take any sort of view like that. Not all young people agree with wokeness. So if you start kind of emulating a perspective that feels really woke to them, it could potentially kind of alienate them as an audience. So I guess it's about considering what sort of risk you're willing to take, which sort of audience you want to capture or not. So I don't think it's necessarily about not doing it, but it's about doing it in a kind of careful way and understanding your objectives out of doing it.
Fantastic. Look, there's no other questions in there. As I said, we'll send around a copy of the chart, and especially for the people who maybe arrived and didn't hear much of it, so we'll make sure you definitely get some stuff coming over. Thank you, everyone, for arriving and listening to our presentation. And if you do have any questions that occur to you afterwards, obviously it often happens, just feel free to drop us a note if you want to discuss anything in more detail. So just remains now to say thank you very much and have a pleasant evening. So
Thank
cheerio.
you.
Bye bye.